for their attendance and their remarks. We now will have opportunity for questioning, and I will recognize myself for questioning. The first is for Dr. Bass. Of the list of 25 troublesome midnight regulations listed in your testimony, which do you believe are the most egregious and should be addressed by Congress and or the new administration?
Of the 25, all 25. That's why we listed them. This is an example of the problem that we're starting to see more of, which is everyone wants the top one or two. What was so surprising about the Bush activity at the end of the administration was the wealth of these rules. You heard Dr. Copeland talk about the numbers. It was quite a large number that you mentioned that are out there. These 25 are, all of these are now effective, minus 2 of them. It seems to me there is no one-size-fits-all solution for all of these. At this stage, we're going to have to make sure that Congress and the Obama administration work in a coordinated fashion to resolve rule by rule how to deal with these.
And when you say those 25 are troublesome, are you talking about procedure as well as substance?
A mixture of both. There were some, Mr. Kennedy described some rushed examples like on the endangered species. I think there are others. For example, we may all disagree on the HHS healthcare provider conscience rule. We may have very different values about it. But what was striking about the process is the OMB review of the rule, which is usually measured in weeks or months, was done in hours. And what that meant is that agencies like the EEOC that normally would comment on a rule didn't get a chance to even comment on the rule itself. That means that it isn't a violation of law, it's a violation of process of good rulemaking. That's what causes the problem with many of these.
You mentioned that many of the Bush midnight regulations were favors to special interests.
Yes.
Which regulations were you referring to, and which special interests were the primary beneficiaries of Bush midnight rules? For example, I don't know if Mr. William Wichterman, a former lobbyist for the NFL, worked in his capacity at the White House Office of Public Liaison on a controversial midnight regulation dealing with the implementation of the Internet gambling law. Is that one of the issues that you raised in your remarks and trouble you?
We did not specifically raise that, but that would be an example of the kind of thing we're talking about. There are really 3 types of issues. One is the influence of money in politics, as you're suggesting. There's uncertainty when there's opacity with many of these rules about who is getting the best deal out of this. The second is industry-wide. Mr. Kennedy talked about the mountaintop mining as a rule that services a particular industry. That's another type of concern. And then I think the third kind of issue that's at bay here is simply the notion of a broader anti-regulatory, deregulatory agenda. And there's some irony that the Bush administration, we all know the Bush administration was never friendly to regulation, and yet they chose to use the regulatory process as the vehicle for achieving much of the policy and priorities, which was deregulatory in the last stages of its administration.
Professor Bromwich, let me ask you a question. You mentioned a 15th, 16th president. I presume you're assuming 2 terms and breaking in at a half year, or is that just kind of a...
Well, so I was assuming, sort of done the math wrong, but I was assuming if we had a 3-month period, 3 months is a fourth of a year, and so the 3-month period would be 1/16 of a presidential term. So I was actually assuming a 4-year term. And of course, I recognize that the president will continue to exercise the powers of the office, even in that last 1/16 beyond the executive branch. The concern is diminishing the powers or potentially even essentially eliminating them within that sphere of influence.
You said that you were afraid that maybe some folks would be embarrassed to publish last-minute regulations for fear they'd be overturned. Can you cite me an example of a politician who's been embarrassed by something they wanted to do?
That's a good point, Mr. Chairman.
Beulah?
I think that it's still possible on many things that fly below the radar. Officials in these agencies who are not necessarily people who are running for elective office might be concerned and might hold back on progressing out of concern that they might look bad if the regulations were disapproved.
And you, from your testimony, you see this as a bipartisan problem that you've seen.
Yes, midnight regulations have occurred in Republican and Democratic administrations alike.
Some people wonder why the interest organizations are not challenging each individual rule under the Administrative Procedure Act. Are these midnight regulations difficult to challenge under the Administrative Procedures Act, and therefore congressional action might be warranted to give a more efficient process for challenge?
I don't think so, Mr. Chairman. I think we do have an ordinary litigation process in which one can raise procedural and substantive objections to regulations. And indeed, if in fact a regulation has not gone through the customary review processes, if in fact there have been comments that have been completely ignored, as for example Kennedy suggested has happened, that should considerably weaken the case of the agency if it subsequently attempts to defend the rule in court. If there is litigation against the agency challenging a particular rule, if the agency simply hasn't dotted its I's and crossed its T's by responding to comments, then under the general hard look doctrine that the courts apply in these circumstances, the rule probably would be struck down by the courts in any event. So it's true, certainly, that administrations may have a temptation to take shortcuts at the end of an administration. But in doing so, they take the risk that the regulations will not be durable in any event because they will not survive judicial review.
Thank you, Professor.